What's up, everybody? Welcome to today's episode of Pro Democracy Pod. We have Alex Gutentag. She's a journalist and former school teacher who's been writing about the holes in the science of the pandemic. She's got a wonderful piece out at Tablet Magazine called "COVID Affects Your Memory." Alex, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so you kind of summarized it. I'm a columnist at Tablet right now, and I'm writing about COVID, mostly policies around COVID. And before that, I was a school teacher. I got into talking about these issues, the lockdowns, the policies around COVID, because I was a school teacher. And I was interested in why the schools were closed.
So you were telling us. Oh, go ahead, Mila.
Yeah, that's something that that's in particular something that I had been really concerned about as well. And I had recently talked to a school teacher here who taught high school, and I personally found that online learning, and I'm in university, I'm in law school, and I find online learning really difficult. So I was thinking, like, how the hell are kids supposed to do this? And so I thought it was really great to see somebody talking about that, and we're definitely interested in hearing your insights on how that's impacted kids who have been going through online schooling.
Yeah, so I can sort of talk about a little bit of my experience with that. So like you said, virtual learning was a disaster. When the schools first closed, there was absolutely no plan for virtual learning. Like, it's very important for people to know. They closed the schools and there was no contingency plan. It wasn't like we're ready to go with all this online curriculum and all the teachers are trained and all the kids know how to use the computers really well. When we closed, the first 2 weeks was just treated like a long break. Then it was clear we weren't going back for another couple of months, and then that turned into over a year. As soon as it was clear we weren't going back for another couple of months, they did distribute computers from the schools, but a lot of kids, more low-income kids, didn't have internet access at home. So what that meant was that kids who were more affluent were having like full Zoom class, and a lot of online work, and kids who were not were basically cut off from school for the rest of the year. So kids from low-income communities, I would say, were just completely deprived of school for the last 2-3 months of school. Then I'm in California, so when we were moving into the fall, and it was clear that we still were not going to go back to school, they did distribute hotspots. Like, all these tech companies just donated all these hotspots so that kids could access online learning. And we then had a lot more programming, a better schedule. There was a lot more accountability for teachers, so people taught a lot more, and there was a more equity for the kids in terms of what they got. But I would say that I was teaching at the middle school level, and basically they cut like the amount of school time in half. So first of all, kids didn't get, all the social time at school, but then in terms of the amount of class time they got, it was about half of what they'd normally get in the year. And on top of that, what I would hear from teachers was like they were getting through maybe a third of the material they'd normally get through in a week. So all of that amounts to maybe kids getting a sixth of what they should have gotten in a year, which is basically like missing a full school year, in my opinion. So, and then obviously you guys might remember there was all this talk of like learning loss is not real, the standards don't matter, and that's basically exactly the opposite of like all the training I ever had as a teacher and every single thing we were talking about before any of this happened, which was that the standards were very important, rigorous instruction was very important, and it was extremely crucial for kids to meet certain milestones within certain windows. And then, of course, we did end up going back. I went back in April. When I was back almost full time. And of course, then it started to become become more clear to me that the impact wasn't just going to go away once we were back, because with kids wearing masks, there's all kinds of other secondary effects. And to me, because I had been paying really close attention to the data and the studies on the lockdowns and the studies on masks from the beginning, I became very concerned, not just with the potential harms of masks, but more so just having kids do things that didn't make sense to continue to perpetuate the sense to them that they were in a lot of danger. Because since the 2020, it was clear from the data that schools were probably the safest place for kids to be, and also one of the safest places in the community in general with regards to COVID. So because of that, I ended up leaving, because I'm not really comfortable with telling kids that they're not safe when I think they're safe.
Yeah, and like what kind of psychological damage does that do to children to just make them live in fear all the time? That's another thing that, you know, like what kind of long-term damage is that giving?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I hope that, okay, well, in terms of what, in 2020, they had some data from the CDC, just from school closures, that kids' mental health related visits to the ER had increased by 30%. And then for 2021, it like increased by 40%. So I think there's a lot of psychological effects that we don't know about or see, but I think the isolation has been a big thing. Kids not being able to see their friends, having a lot of tension around socialization, like not knowing all the rules all the time. And I think most importantly, a lot of kids are probably internalizing the sense that it might be dangerous to interact freely with their peers, or to go places, or to do their preferred activities. And I think that this is something also people have talked about a bit, is that in the beginning especially, there was a lot of messaging to kids that they were vectors of disease and that they were like putting other people at risk. And I think that's one thing that kids do actually worry about quite a lot, is that they are going to get other people sick, even though they're not worried for themselves to get sick, but that they're going to get other people sick. And I don't know if you remember, you might have seen it a long time ago, but in the LA Times, they had this crazy article about a year ago about kids apologizing to their elderly dying relatives for like basically killing them by children. So I think that is probably the most harmful.
So really quick, I need to apologize to our audience, because apparently there were two streams that were made on Rockfin. This is my fault. I don't know what I did wrong. So I deleted one of them and it closed our stream, but I was able to get the other one back up. So it's a little, you guys are watching a little late. You can just rewind from the beginning to see the whole show. And again, I apologize for that little technical difficulty. Alex, I want to talk to you about an article in the New York Times, because you were just talking about how disadvantaged communities were affected by the virtual learning, maybe not having a Wi-Fi connection. Of course, big tech jumped in to save the day, because I think ultimately for big tech, this is a good investment for them. They want to go to virtual learning. They want schools to be using the tools that they develop to conduct education. So I think that rather than viewing that as like an act of philanthropy, it needs to be understood as an investment. But that only happened later in the process. There's a New York Times article that you mentioned, which says that virtual learning provided Black families a relief from racism. I think it's something like 32% of Black children live in poverty in the United States. I live in Mexico, where many families have more than one child and don't have a single computer, or only have one computer. And I watched over the course of the pandemic children not going to school and just spend their days and even nights, up until 3 a.m. outside playing with their friends, which is, that sounds nice, but at the same time, they're putting at a massive disadvantage when it comes to the rest of their schooling years and joining the workforce, becoming adults, or going to college. So, I mean, could you talk about, like, I don't know what the racial makeup of where you were teaching was, but did you, like, children that were already at disadvantage, like, what do you think this means for their future as far as, like, the playing field, really?
Yeah, so I was teaching in a low-income area, high poverty. Almost every kid qualified for free and reduced lunch, all students of color. And that's also the setting that I always taught in for the 8 years that I was teaching. So I think one thing that was kind of under discussed before all this, and is still under discussed, is that it's really common in those settings for kids to be very severely behind already. So in the middle school level, it's very common for kids to come into 6th grade 1 year behind in reading, 2 years behind in reading, 3 or 4 years behind. And the kids who are on grade level, by the time they're adolescents, are the minority, the sometimes extreme minority. So there's already a very huge problem of educational failure in terms of the way that the public education system has already been serving those students or failing to serve those students. And like I mentioned, this was something that in education we were talking about all the time, right? And the achievement gap discourse was talked about all the time. What is, like, the achievement gap if not, the effects of learning loss, cumulative learning loss over time? So certain students don't have as experienced teachers, don't have as many resources, miss out on certain early learning opportunities, and then they're at a disadvantage. And then as those effects accumulate, it just creates more and more of a feedback loop where they fall more and more behind. So I think that there was already a big problem with literacy, numeracy, basic skills for a lot of low-income students to begin with. And now it's just going to be even worse. So I don't know. Yeah. I think that probably answers your question, but I think on top of that, you see a lot of, like, I guess, lasting impact also from that year of school they missed. A lot of schools are seeing more kind of, I don't know how to put it, but disciplinary problems. Like, there were schools closing because of fights. They, things like that, saying we're going to take, an extra week of Thanksgiving break to do distance learning because the school is just too chaotic. I think those things might just keep happening because there's too much instability, and then kids are just going to miss out even more on learning.
Yeah. So the answer is not good.
Yeah, and the New York Times article where they said that it was a relief from racism and stuff. I mean, there was a lot of talk of like that in especially the summer of 2020, where people were basically saying, like, schools are bad for Black students because they're over disciplined in school, and schools are racist. So therefore it's actually good for them to be doing virtual learning, but it's actually a lot more racist and a lot worse, in my opinion, for them to, like, not get an education. And the public, I would say, was misled into thinking that virtual learning was in any way a substitute for in-person education, which it wasn't. And I'd also add that I also think it's racist the way that a lot of people were talking about certain kids or certain communities, because when the schools were closed, at least here, private schools could get vouchers to reopen. So a lot of private schools were open. And when I would bring it up, well, the affluent white neighborhoods, our kids are going to school because they're going to private school. a lot of times the response would be like, well, they have lower cases, so it's fine. So I think if you're going to set things up like that, well, some people just are healthy and some people are unhealthy. This is like a very old form of racism, to portray people as diseased, in my opinion.
Right.
Yeah, of course. Well, it's also
go ahead.
like something that's also brought up, like, because obviously the New York Times and a lot of publications are using a lot of social justice-y or anti-oppression language, and race is one of it, but so is disability. That's like one of the things that have really been making the rounds. You kind of see a lot of arguments that opening up is eugenics. That's kind of making the rounds a lot. And it was interesting because I recently did an interview with a school teacher here in high school. He's an educational aide. I published it on my Substack, but he himself is disabled. And I was asking him about what his thoughts were on online schooling. And he was saying that for him, it was actually more exhausting to be online than it is to be in person. And he works with disabled students who have cognitive disabilities, who also struggle with screen learning as well. So it's very selective, it seems to me, when we're using the lens of disability as well, or any sort of anti-oppression lens. But I'm wondering what you're making now of these arguments about, okay, yeah, it's eugenics. Are we engaging in eugenics right now by being concerned about about in person and online and stuff like that?
I mean, okay, I have somewhat similar experience to the person you interviewed, because so at the time when the schools were closed, I was teaching special education, so I was also working with kids with disabilities. I had like several conversations before the fall 2020 school year started, because it had seemed for a minute like we might go back. And I asked, like, for the kids with severe disabilities, like, I don't care, like, I'll wear a hazmat suit, like, we can do it outside. Can we please get those kids some services? Because for kids with severe disabilities, school is like a daily function activity. It's like not just for learning academic skills, but learning life skills. And nothing could be more essential. It's not a healthcare service always, but it's at that level, in my opinion, what's essential. And the answer that I got back was like, absolutely not. And that's not going to happen, even though the American Pediatrics Association had been saying kids need to be back in school, especially kids with disabilities. So I think, and some of the pushback that I got was that people with disabilities were like more vulnerable to COVID, so it's actually more dangerous for the kids with disabilities to be back in school. I think that the problem with that argument is that it needs to be differentiated. People who have general disability, like a cognitive disability, and someone who is an older person or a very immunocompromised person or someone who's in the hospital. These are different things. So I think when people are using the lens of disability, they're using it very generally and
generously.
They're not basing it on like data. Like no one could say to me like, well, here's a study that showed like an 11-year-old with a cognitive disability is going to die of COVID-19. Like that's not what was presented. It was just presented as a general concept. So I think that what the main issue is that there's a lot of unproven statements going on there. Like they haven't proven in that statement, okay, if you open up and people who are young and healthy can live their lives, that means that more people will die. Like they actually haven't proven that the lockdowns do anything, right? And there was a study from Johns Hopkins that came out that said that but it was like a 2% reduction in mortality from the lockdowns, and then all of these other horrible second order consequences, which also negatively impact the health of people with disabilities. So they're just taking it for granted that if things are closed, that will protect the vulnerable, and that's not proven. And then they're taking it for granted that masks work, and that's not proven. And they're taking it for granted that vaccine passports work, and that's not proven. So I would say that the main issue is just that it's completely not based on any data whatsoever. It's basically just weaponizing social justice politics around a specific identity group to ram through things that are bad for everyone, including most likely that identity group.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the second order effects of the lockdowns.
Mm-hmm.
I've been pretty insulated from that because I've been living in Mexico. The town I'm in right now had they told their businesses to shut down for a total of 7 days, and that was it. So I'm very fortunate, but I do know that, there was something like 1,000 small businesses closing per day in the United States throughout the pandemic. And that one thing you talk about in your article is teenage suicide ideation, I guess is the professional term for it. You talk about, Mila, I know, has talked about the increase of drug use, these kinds of things. Why is that conversation being ignored? I mean, if we're focusing on people with disabilities and people who are uniquely vulnerable, why is one side of the issue like totally ignored in your view? And I mean, is there any insight that you can give us on, like, I don't know, teenagers with mental health issues and how they were affected?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason,
I know it's a very general question. I'm sorry.
I think the reason it's being ignored, I think, just goes back to how this all started in the beginning, which was that you couldn't question the lockdowns, you couldn't talk about any sort of cost benefit analysis. It was seen as like murdering people to say, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I think that it just, the relic of the extremely intense, not just propaganda campaign, but sort of culture that was instantaneously out of thin air developed around all this stuff, is just still with us. And I think that is still informing a lot of the sense of what people can and can't talk about or can and can't question. I think it's definitely changing, and it's becoming more acceptable to talk about the lockdown harms that happened. I think one of the biggest reasons also is that with the lockdown, there was this massive transfer of wealth. So it was something like 1.3 trillion lost by American workers and 1 trillion gained by American billionaires. I don't know if I flipped the numbers, but you had, of course, like massive closure of small businesses and huge expansion of major corporate profits, like with Amazon and also with other tech companies. So I think that there's some material interest in kind of maintaining the illusion that this was just only about health. And then in terms of like impact on teens of mental health, I think that demoralization is, for like low-income kids, I feel like that's one of the biggest problems. Just kids losing a sense of like there's a point. And I don't really blame them, because I mean, if I was in distance learning, if I had been in distance learning for a year, and I knew that like all the adults and all the teachers who supposedly cared about me or were supposedly trying to teach me were just going to abandon me at the drop of a hat, I probably would not feel super invested in my education either. And I would also feel probably not great about myself. So.
Well, I see a lot of teachers. It's actually kind of been baffling to me at all levels, in university and high school and elementary, tweeting about like they literally view their students as these vectors of disease and who are, like, I don't think if you're viewing students this way, I don't really know if you should be teaching. There's that component. But I mean, I was kind of shocked as well to see a lot of teachers unions again demand online learning to stay in place and stuff like that. I wonder, like, are they psyoped by a lot of this COVID hysteria? Is it because they don't want to, commute? Do they genuinely view these students as vectors of disease? I don't know, but to me, it's very disturbing because I think if you're going to take on this kind of job, and this is again what like the teacher that I interviewed was saying as well, like you need to have love for your students in a way and like care about their well-being and care about their learning outcomes. So I don't know. But on the other hand, like I get it because I get teachers' frustration in general because they're severely underpaid in a lot of cases. And I can also understand the stress as well in this scenario. But it has been a little bit frustrating to observe.
Yeah, likewise, it's very frustrating. I mean, sometimes I kind of say things that I feel like maybe are too harsh to the teachers, and then sometimes I feel like maybe I'm go too easy on them. I don't really know what the right balance is, and I feel like being close to the situation, it makes me see it less clearly, to be honest. Like, I don't know what's going on with them. I feel like you would think because I was one and I was there and I had all those conversations and I saw what went down, that I'd have special insight into why this is their perspective, but I actually don't. I'm just like too close to the situation or something. I think that I think it was a very difficult job, very emotionally, psychologically, physically draining. So I think there was a lot of relief. There was some relief when people got a little bit of a break. And I think that the teachers also feel more aligned with people they know who have professional jobs where they have to work at home. They didn't feel aligned with essential workers. So in terms of their class position. So because of that, I think they felt more like they were also entitled to be working at home, because for a lot of teachers, those are your friends, your spouse, like the class that your education level, all those factors I think kind of tied in. I had been a union rep for 3 years before this, and we had gone on strike in the year before the school closures. So I do think, and I kind of think sometimes the strike wave had some impact too, because in a lot of places where we've had strikes, people didn't feel like we got enough and they wanted more. So there was like this restlessness or this feeling of dissatisfaction. So, and I think that made people more inclined to be more aligned with the union and be kind of trust the union's perspective more than the district's perspective or more than the administrator's perspective, which like I would have thought was a really good thing, but now I think was not because of how it has played out. I think that there's also just like teachers are not the most like free thinking group of people all the time. That's why people remember their teachers who were like kind of odd, because most because most of your teachers are kind of conformists because they're like rule enforcers. That's their job. Like they have to socialize kids. So you're more inclined to be someone who goes along with the rules. So I think that people are I think that teachers just in general like rules, so they and they're not super predisposed to like go against the grain. I think a lot of teachers, I think there are a lot of teachers who have had doubts about virtual learning. A lot of teachers absolutely hated it, but they just wouldn't really position themselves to go against what the dominant narrative was about it from their news sources or from their community. So, yeah.
And, you know, I mean, if I'm just going to be like super frank, and I don't mean this against you personally, Alex, but like, fuck the teachers. Like, it's about the kids. You know, this is they're the essential workers. This is a public school system that is supposed to like provide a path towards success for every American child. It's not about the teachers. Fuck the teachers. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I mean,
like I just don't want to, like the thing of it is I feel like I just don't want to be too hard on them, because I just feel like who's gonna teach? You know, like we still need them. That's the problem.
Absolutely. And they are paid like shit. So
yeah, I mean, it's like unfortunately there's not like some other reserve population of people who are gonna come in and do the job. You know,
right.
We still have the same population of teachers, so I feel like they need like you just have to like kind of coddle them and give them off ramps or something.
All right, I take it back.
No one's gonna do it, you know. And then people like me or people who, for other similar reasons to me, are more, I don't know, have other opinions on things. Like you kind of eventually get pushed out, or you can't take it. So I think it's tough because they did really mess up, but you know, who's gonna do their job?
Well, I think it's funny that like, you know, people who are critical of the lockdowns, and it's usually the left that's attacking us. These past days, I'm getting like 30 Twitter notifications every time I refresh, because I did some wrong thing. But they tell us that this is the capitalist position, is to like have things open, and at the same time they're destroying public schools.
Yeah,
they're enabling billionaires like Bill Gates who want to move totally to virtual learning. They're enabling Jeff Bezos to, you know, service us through Amazon for the rest of our lives. And they're destroying the futures of some of the most vulnerable people in our society.
Right.
So well, I think you're, and we're the ones that are, you know, pro-capitalist while they're destroying public schools. That's the part that's like really frustrating to me. They say, oh well, the Kochs support ending the lockdowns. It's like, okay, like the Kochs are like just one small fraction of like the oligarchy, right? Like there's a lot of other people that like and like what do the Koch, like they're not, like technology is the future of the ruling class. Like we've seen this, and the Kochs are not like super, they're not leaders in technology. It's the Zuckerbergs, it's the Bezos, it's the Omidyars and the Gates, that are like the kind of leaders in that field, and they're going to be a lot more rich than the Kochs, who are just kind of like ideologues that happen to be rich, right?
Well, the problem right now, I think, is the left thinks it's like they still think it's like 2005, like in a lot of issues, not just this. But when they talk about like even things like, they still think that like Christian fundamentalism is like a big problem.
Yeah, right.
And just stuff like that, you know, like they still,
I mean,
they still don't,
I'll give some credit to that.
The culture war, like they don't get that, like culture has now moved left. And so similarly, I think like they're having a hard time, you know, embracing or contending with the fact that a lot of them are now carrying water for these tech oligarchs because the nature of the ruling class itself has changed, right? And so, I kind of wrote about this in my Substack piece on online schooling, but like who's the biggest beneficiary? It's companies like Zoom who've seen record profits.
Yeah.
It's also paving the way just for other just total virtual interactions like the metaverse or whatever, and that's terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same playbook. They want to. I mean, nothing has changed fundamentally about what the ruling class wants. COVID did not change that, right? Like they still want us as individuals atomized. They want the desolation of community in favor of like hyper individualism. They want us to live in the proverbial pod and eat the proverbial bugs, and at the same time, their tactic is divide and conquer. It's just like if you have any kind of, even if you say the truckers in Ottawa are working class, then you're a white supremacist. Like because there was one dude there that had a swastika. That makes the whole thing racist. If we're gonna use that kind of bar, then we really need to avoid any discussion of Occupy Wall Street. But I think it's just the divide and conquer strategy, which like the left wasn't always like this. Again, Occupy, like Occupy was had a wide variety of ideologies, including many that were far right. Under our understanding of it, somewhere along the line, things changed, and it's become a situation where any kind of divergence from the groupthink is a reflection of white supremacy. And I think even more recently in the past, since the 2016 election, the mainstream media and the ruling class of Democrats have realized that this is very helpful for them to have this idea that anybody who disagrees is like evil and can't be associated with or worked with, and just needs to, the only way is to ostracize them. And unfortunately, the left is taking that approach. Like again, I like the amount of hate that I'm seeing for just challenging like any kind of ideas. Maybe you could speak to this, Alex, if you've had any experience with that. I know Mila's been getting a lot of stuff lately. I saw some tweets that were very anti-Mila.
Sorry.
Here's the thing. Like, I mean, you have like the Communist Party of Canada is denouncing the truckers as white supremacists. Basically, every communist organization in the U.S. is denouncing the truckers as racist. And I don't see any evidence. Like, I mean, besides like one or two people, but like I've seen more photos of minorities at these protests and videos of interviews with minorities denouncing this mainstream media talking point than I have seen of people doing anything demonstrably racist at these protests.
Yeah, well, one of the biggest leaders of the Freedom Convoy organizing right now here is a North African woman. And there's a lot
racist.
So racist. But yeah, like people also started calling me an Islamophobe, which I haven't heard since like the Syria days, which is funny. Like half my family is Muslim, so I was kind of like, that is, I mean, I haven't heard that one in a while. Yeah, and it's like, of course, like people with like who definitely are not Muslim at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, apparently now like it's also Islamophobic to say we shouldn't paint these protests with one brush. I don't know why. I don't know where that came from.
Well, it's everything bigoted, right? Like Trudeau said it himself. It's like transphobic, anti-Semitic, homophobic, like, but and like the left has the same fucking line as Justin Trudeau. Like, what is happening? It's amazing to me. And like this is a massive protest. There's a lot of people. The capital city is shut down in Canada. And you're going to tell me one dude with a swastika represents the whole thing? Like, go there, talk to people, see what they're about, watch the live streams, you know? So that's what frustrates me. But I want to know if you've gotten any kind of pushback. I do have to end the Twitter live stream, so we're going to move exclusively to Rockfin.
So you have to subscribe to us to learn about the haters and losers.
The URL is right here, rockfin.com/ProDemPod. Go there. Join us for the rest of the conversation. And Alex, I'd like to. We're going to talk about your most recent article, the COVID affects memory loss, in a bit. But I want to know what kind of pushback you've gotten.
I mean, I feel like the biggest pushback in the beginning. It was just like, you're a murderer. And now,
the person who spent years teaching special education, now all of a sudden, like, something flipped in their brain and they want to kill everyone.
Gotta watch out.
Well, I haven't gotten I've just been too gone for too long, so I haven't gotten the racist stuff so much. I mean, but I think then even before the vaccines came out, people would say you're an anti-vaxxer. It was but what vaccine? But there was no vaccine, so that was one of their main ones. And I think now that the murderer and anti-vaxxer things have fallen off, people are getting more of the racism ones from the left.
Yeah, I think that's very common. I mean, I don't know. My school had this town hall because our dean made the very big controversial decision that a bunch of healthy 20-year-olds or people in their 20s should attend law school in person. I don't know if anyone's watched a court over Zoom, but it's a nightmare. You just cannot, it's really, law is not a good subject to do online. I don't think any schooling is, but law is pretty bad. And there's a town hall, and I spoke up in the town hall, which apparently now I just learned a lot of people are just talking crap about me for it, but I spoke up in favor of in-person learning, and there was a lot of people who just started saying this is eugenics, I'm a Nazi or a eugenicist, and it was probably a bad time to dye my hair blonde, actually. but yeah, just stuff like that, and it kind of makes reasonable engagement impossible. It was a very emotional town hall. There was not a lot of reasonable or level-headed debate. It was just kind of how dare you, you're a eugenicist, because you're concerned about learning outcomes and mental health, which I mean, this is a popular left tactic, but I almost have kind of expected it to be seen through by now.
I feel the eugenics thing is really interesting because the people who are telling people that they are a eugenicist for wanting to live it's 2019 are the same people who want people to get forced medical procedures or coerced medical procedures. And the foundational document that the most famous one that we know from what came out of the Holocaust is the Nuremberg Code. So it's just really interesting that people, I feel they're just projecting or something, because it's kind of strange that people who have very much a eugenicist mindset, where people should be, basically pushed to have any sort of coercive experimental procedure, they're the ones saying it's eugenics if you don't want that. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I think
and they're the same ones saying that if you don't get it, then you go to the back of the line for other medical healthcare, basically,
Yeah, their rhetoric is just so intense, has been very intense about unvaccinated people, saying they should be removed from the level of they should be removed from society. So I think, I don't want to call people Nazis, but if anyone is more resemblance to that type of thinking, it's not the people who just want, their kids to have normal lives.
Yeah, of course. And even Like I said, even with university education, I really think I've seen negative impact of, being on a screen the entire day. And I almost feel like I'm being kind of gaslit by these people who are kind of trying to minimize it and say it's not a big deal, because it's just not normal to be staring at a screen for that long and to like try and learn for that long. And I've seen a lot of popular articles and posts like, oh, what are these people's obsession with being in school in person, like, and it's it's like, what do you mean obsession?
Like they'll say like it's like a fetish.
Yeah. And it's like, I mean, again, this is just anecdotal, but I have personally have post-concussion issues. So like I could not like use a screen in class. Like I write my notes by hand and stuff like that. And so like for me, Zoom school was not great. And and I'm just kind of like, it's so funny to be accused of ableism for wanting in-person school, because I'm like, there are actually a lot of there's other kinds of disabilities, like you were saying before, that like make Zoom school unideal. And even like, again, in our things like our court system, like a lot of trials have been moved to Zoom. And I was thinking, like, imagine being sentenced to like 25 years in prison over a computer screen. It's very dystopian to me.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about your article before we end the show. Just give us a basic idea of what your argument is. Like, if you could summarize your thesis for not to go too hard on the theme here today, but tell us about your approach and why you decided to do it, and I guess what the idea behind the piece is.
Yeah, so the article is called COVID Affects Your Memory. And it's not literally that it affects your memory. It's not some long COVID diatribe. It's just about how basically the narrative has kind of shifted in the mainstream media, at least, where a lot of the kind of policies and restrictions that they once justified are now very much in question, and it's the whole process of which this has happened is kind of being memory hold, and it's not really gaslighting, but it's like the common term for it would be gaslighting is what's going on. And I think you can see this even more just in the past week with all these Democratic politicians acting like haven't been super pro-restriction when they have. There's a lot of arguments people are making, like things have changed, the science has changed, so now we should open up, or now we should go back to normal, or now we should take the masks off the kids. Science has not changed. There is no new evidence. There's like buzzwords, but there's not new evidence. And you can look at the daily deaths, which have a lot of data problems in them, but the daily deaths are not like zero right now. And they're kind of trying to get an off-ramp to restrictions without going back and saying those restrictions were wrong, those restrictions didn't work, those restrictions were based off faulty data. They're just making an off-ramp without admitting how wrong they were, without apologizing. And I think basically, I just think it's very important for us to not let that happen and basically hold people to account for the things that they said or the things that they made people believe. So a couple of weeks ago, there was like every single outlet, The Atlantic, the New York Times, the Washington Post had pieces about how like maybe kids shouldn't wear masks in schools. But 2 weeks before that, they'd be slandering people as like anti-mask, eugenicists, things like that, for suggesting that the masks in schools were not a great idea. There's very much a sense of like now things are acceptable to say that weren't acceptable to say, almost like this switch has been flipped. And I think it's important to go back and look at the whole history of how this happened, what exactly the data says, and what exactly is going on here, instead of just letting the people who completely deceived the public for many, many months about what was going on continue to try to control the narrative.
Yeah, it is important to hold people to account for what they said, and that's exactly what you do in your article, and one of the reasons why it's so great. I'd like to just share a few small portions of it. I don't want to share because you do give many examples with data of how the narrative around the science has changed, and so I encourage people to read your piece for all those examples that you provide. There's many. I could have taken notes, but I don't want to defeat the purpose of your article, and I want to tell people to go read it themselves. But it's a really good piece, and there's a lot of examples of changes that have been made. But I do want to share one quote from you, a couple things from your piece. One quote, and then one example. The quote is: "It would be one thing if the change in messaging tracked a dramatic change in available evidence, or even if the messengers candidly acknowledged a, quote, evolution in their thinking. But neither is the case. The change is simply taking place with no recognition or apology." And I think this has a lot to do with politics, right?
Mhm.
I was saying throughout the early days of the pandemic that the mainstream media was using COVID to attack Trump. And, that's fine.
Mhm.
Attack Trump all you want. But you had even Kamala Harris, a lot of people in the mainstream media, but Kamala most notably saying that they wouldn't trust the vaccine under Trump. That's changed, and now we have the midterms coming, and it's important that the Democrats don't look like total failures.
Mhm.
So I think that has a lot. It's kind of like prep work for the midterms, so that it's going to be plausible for them to say during the midterms, like, look, we've been saying this for a while now, so that's one thing. But I do want to talk about uh, 2 paragraphs that you have on Brian Stelter, who to me is just like a very funny man. He's like 36.
No.
All right. I'm sorry. Okay. So here's what you say. You say major cable news outlets offered a similar coverage, and perhaps due to the precipitous drops in viewership, are also starting to backpedal. A representative example came on July 9th, 2022, when the 7-day average for daily COVID deaths is about 1,700. And CNN's Brian Stelter said on his show that the situation was, quote, complicated and nuanced. He added that, quote, doomsday doctors were, quote, pushing people toward even more fear, anxiety, and depression, and asked, quote, is there an undue amount of fear being spread? Stelter's widely watched segment was remarkable for its contrast to his previous approach. On May 10, 2020, when there were about 1,900 COVID-related deaths a day, Stelter called it a, quote, Hurricane Katrina every day, and said it was as if, quote, 10 planes crashed every day. According to Stelter in 2020, to look away from the death count being in brackets, or act like it's now normal is a disgrace to the victims. In January 2022, with almost the same number of daily deaths, Stelter acknowledged that we need to face, quote, the reality about learning to live with COVID. That's to me the most standout example, besides all the changes around the science. This is more around how we talk about the pandemic.
Mhm.
But this is the most wonderful example to me of the polar opposite narratives that have been pushed. On one side, it's Hurricane Katrina every day, which Hurricane Katrina was a lot, that's just a stupid thing to say, because it was a lot more than just the deaths, right? Hurricane Katrina, it was the destruction of a historic Black community, and a city. It wasn't just the deaths, the birthplace of jazz music was destroyed. So I think that's just a stupid thing to say. But on the other hand, it's now it's like, wow, we really need to reflect on this,
Mhm.
I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, so I think the pivot they're making is they're saying, well, because we have vaccines and because of Omicron, now it's a different situation, and now it's nuanced, now it's complicated, and like people should be free to live their lives now because the restrictions have gone on too long. But the problem is, like, there was never a justification for those restrictions, and there was never evidence that those restrictions worked by any plausible metric. So you have them saying things like, I mean, like Chris Hayes the other day on Twitter was saying, all the people dying are unvaccinated. So I think everyone needs to think really logically. The daily deaths was like 2,500, like 7-day average today. So this should be, by their own logic, a 9/11 every day. If you had before the vaccines the median age of death around 80, and now you have like 95% of 80-year-olds vaccinated, is it really plausible that the only reason why the deaths are still so high is that really plausible that it's because it's only unvaccinated people dying? No, that the math just doesn't check out. And the problem is they have been doing intensive data manipulation this entire time, and a lot of misrepresentation about which groups are most vulnerable for severe illness and death this entire time. So instead of backtracking and saying, okay, wait, actually we had a problem with the data, we had a problem with how we represented this, they're just trying to say, like, all of this was good up until we decided that it didn't matter, and now we decided that it doesn't matter, and now actually this is why it's okay that there's a 9/11 every day. So the one of the biggest issues has been with versus from COVID, and now the Biden administration is looking at decoupling that figure in the hospitalization
just in time for the midterms.
Yeah,
sorry.
So we should really be asking, okay, so now if they say we're not counting with anymore, those numbers are going to go way down, and you're going to see significant success of all their measures. But are they going to go back and audit all the previous data? Because if they don't go back and audit all the previous data and make those same changes, that's a huge problem. I know for me, where I was teaching in my county, there was an audit, and they had to take off like 25% of the deaths had no plausible connection to COVID, but were just within a certain amount of time, someone had a positive, like within 60 days, someone had a positive PCR test and then died. So
it's 3/4 of 9/11.
Presented to me as why we can't teach in person. You know, like those numbers had a really big effect. Those numbers affected a lot of people's lives. So I think that basically it's disingenuous, it's fraudulent, and this whole idea that like the science has changed does not hold up at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of, you know, it's in BC here in my province, like the public health officer admitted that about like at least 40% of deaths counted were with COVID rather than from COVID, and that did not really make many headlines. Like I was kind of surprised because every little thing to do with COVID here makes massive headlines. And it's you know, it's just been the entirety of our news cycles here in BC. But, you know, this is a very significant thing.
Yeah.
It is part of the science, so to speak, but it's very underplayed. And it's just kind of funny to me because I think that like there's such a drive to just make us permanently afraid of this. And like another sort of funny anecdote, but like the other day I shared like a meme on Instagram because it showed like the symptoms of the Omicron thing, and like I shared like, oh, you can just take Buckley's for this, like as a joke, but it was like, you know, those things like a cough, a sore throat, whatever. And they gave my account like a warning today, being like, you're spreading false information because you're suggesting that Omicron is like a cold. And I'm like, this is literally just a meme that you can take some Buckley's or whatever and it'll help you with your COVID. So like, you know, there's such an anger at just, you know, if you just do whatever they think of as minimizing COVID, then it's like you're committing like such a big sin. And
Yeah.
it's, again, I think it's actually really terrible for our collective mental health because
Yeah.
we're not even allowed to feel hopeful. There was another thing where, you know, someone, there was like an announcement saying Omicron is milder, only people with like the underlying health conditions are going to be negative, like feel it really badly or something like that. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
And people were so angry at that and saying, oh, this is eugenics. You're saying that like those people don't matter that much because you're saying it's good news. And it's like, no, it's not good news because it's impacting these people. It's good news because there's a lot of people that don't have to worry about it. And I think the media is extremely complicit, not only in, you know, misconstruing science, but in collectively compromising our mental health, by, you know, not accepting anything but total fear.
Yeah.
On the part of the population, and also not accepting any kind of hope either. They just want this permanent state of hopelessness, and that sets the stage for, you know, big tech to just transform the way that we're living. So I don't know, big rant, but starting off with my Instagram almost getting banned, but I just thought it was
Yeah, I mean, they really terrorize the public the whole way. They like all the exponential graphs in the beginning and like the numbers and the death count on CNN. I mean, they really terrorize people, and you can look back on the things like the New York Times was covering around kids, constantly saying kids were vulnerable to like really rare, mysterious, dangerous new symptoms that they were finding out. Never ever comforting parents, saying like if schools open, there will be these crazy outbreaks. Even though schools were already open in Europe and there was no outbreaks tied to them, and they really scared people. So it's very funny now to see them like take up the mantle against COVID neuroticism and say like we are going for like the balanced, you know, approach to choose the correct time to reopen and end the mitigations and like let kids live their lives and stop harming them and stuff. It's not really their place to do that after the harm that they've inflicted.
Yeah.
I would. Oh, go ahead.
There was a big hysteria for a while that low-key fell off about like kids getting diabetes from COVID. Like that was a big like for like a few days, and then I did the radical thing of clicking past the headline and like actually reading what they were saying, and it's always so much less intense than the headline. But it's sad to me because I see a lot of people who are genuinely scared. Like they're not doing this to like they're not doing what the media is doing. They actually just believe it, and they're so scared, and you know, demonizing other people because of it, whether it's like unvaccinated or you know, just like, oh my god, like get away from me, you're not wearing like when I used to go run on the seawall and it was like very pleasant and whatever, and you know, now I notice like people are like when they see you even with like a short distance, they like, you know, kind of are like and it's sad. It's kind of sad, you know, what it's done to us collectively.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have to mute myself because my my fiance is coming home and I have the dogs with me, so they're gonna start freaking out. But I think, you know, I've been saying for a long time that the left has this approach to politics like as though they're permanent losers. I was saying this before COVID, but while liberals are very paranoid about the virus, I think the left, much like other things, they take what the liberals are doing and just dial up, you know, dial it up a little bit. They're just like they just like live in this state of defeat by the virus, you know. And I think, I mean, it's really sad. I mean, again, I've been saying it for a long time that you know, they have like a loser complex, but the defeat that's going on now where like everything's changed forever. I mean, and it works so well with the overall goal of having society atomized. Well, I'm sorry, I lost my thought. I'm a little distracted right now, but I think it's any resistance to the lockdowns or mandates is a non-starter, and that's unfortunate. Especially like Mila, you were just talking about how there was like this narrative that that COVID was going to give kids diabetes. I think the lockdown is more likely to give kids diabetes, right? Like if we're going to talk
there's
about
been data
unhealthy
showing,
habits,
right?
Yeah.
There's been an increase in weight gain among everybody, but also children are having less physical activity, and there has been an uptick in childhood obesity, and these are serious problems. Like obesity is it's not great, no matter what like movements tell you otherwise. You know, like there's a lot of risks. There's a lot of long-term health not only health risks in terms of, you know, physical, but mental as well. If kids don't get to play and move, like it's not good for you. It's not even, I'm almost 27, and if I don't like exercise once a day, I get sad. So I can't imagine if you're a kid and you're, you know, not moving at all. But I think, Alex, you make a good point that the left has this mentality where it's so defeated. And I saw this tweet from a popular leftist account today making the rounds, where she said, like, it's actually disgusting looking back that we were all just walking around inhaling strangers' saliva in the air all day, every day before 2020. I do not personally plan to return to that state of affairs.
Yeah, so, I'm going to stay in my pod.
Yeah, exactly.
On my laptop, and I won't own anything.
To this new way of living.
It's really sad.
How sad and antisocial.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, just to tack on one thing to what you were saying about obesity, 300,000 people in the U.S. die every year from obesity. So that's a pandemic public health crisis that we haven't confronted as a society, even a little bit. And then COVID comes along, and it's like an all of society confrontation. So I'll leave it at that. I don't know if you guys have more you want to add.
Well, I just have to say, like, I think this is where the profit motive is at, right? Because like there's a huge, like, the junk food, fast food industries, the people really fueling the obesity crises are profiting. Similarly, you know, this pandemic has been extremely profitable to big tech. And so, I mean, if you really look at, I think to understand these inconsistencies when it comes to what we care about, when it comes to public health, we really have to just look to the profit motives and like who stands to benefit. And I mean, I remember when this was a typical leftist concern, and now I think I've gone insane because it doesn't seem to be anymore. But I don't know, back in the day, this seemed to be a leftist concern.
Yeah.
Final thoughts, Alex?
Sorry.
I was asking you for final thoughts, but I was interrupting your final thoughts.
My
apologies.
No, I think that's correct. I think the people who say like that it's gross to breathe the air around other people. I mean, that's just really sad. I feel like they're so brainwashed. I don't know what else you can say about it. Like, your ancestors for so long were breathing near other people, and now you think that you can't breathe air that other people breathe.
I feel like you guys, there's that movie Bubble Boy, right?
Yeah.
The guy who, you know, but I mean, that's the thing, right? Like we are strong as a species because we share germs, right? Like,
yeah.
If you like self-isolate for the rest of your life, you go out once and you're gonna get like this like virus that kills you, or like a bacteria that kills you because you have no natural immunity. I know that's like a white supremacist talking point these days, but like we need to share space with each other to like build up collective immunity against a lot of stuff. That's just been the fact of human evolution for thousands of years.
And it's also very bad for vulnerable people when the rest of us don't build up immunity. If the rest of us who are young, healthy people have no exposure and no immunity, then there's no possible protection for, I mean, I guess they would say they would say only herd immunity is from vaccines, but like that's just not the case. In the process of herd immunity, people get natural infections, and then that protects the more vulnerable groups because it creates like a firewall. So if you don't allow that to happen, then the virus has more opportunity to negatively impact people who would be more at risk from it. So it's actually just completely flipped and completely the opposite of every way that they've portrayed it. Like every single thing they said was selfish is actually okay, and all the things that they said was altruistic is actually caused a lot of harm to the most vulnerable people. And it's just sad to see like statements from people who are just really, really attached to the COVID ideology and can't let it go because they seem just like broken. They seem like the fear stuff has just completely broken their brains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, go ahead, Mila, if you have something else. I was going to.
So that's a good note. That's a good wrap-up message. I mean, it's sad, but like, I think this is something that, needs to be reiterated and fought because all the mainstream media sources are just failing everybody and making everyone sad and anxious all the time. And
well, yeah. I do want to add that it's not surprising to me at all to see such popular antisocial sentiments on a social media.
Yeah.
These people are on Twitter for a reason. So I'll leave it at that. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, if you're on Twitter, go follow Alex. It's at Galaxy with an E. Brain, and that's BRANE. So maybe I'm gonna put I'm gonna put it in the comments because that's a little complicated. Also check out her writing at Tablet Mag. She's doing great work over there. Thanks so much for joining us. It was a really informative conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And we do appreciate your perspective as a former school teacher. So okay, everybody, enjoy your week. We'll see you next week. Probably with more COVID related coverage. I think that's like the main story that we need to be focusing on. Those of us who haven't succumbed to brain worms.
Yeah. Also, we took
a lot of ivermectin
all the time.
Yes.
We took a lot of ivermectin, so we're good. And there's not a lot of people that are being critical of anything that's happening. So we want to keep doing COVID coverage. So we hope to see you next week. Thanks again for joining us.